And now, broadcasting on StarWorldWideNetworks.com, it's time for the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show with Snowden Bishop. Listen in as Snowden interviews cannabis industry pioneers, marijuana experts, policymakers, medical practitioners, patients, and other amazing individuals with compelling stories to share. It all happens right now. Here's the Cannabis Reporter, Snowden Bishop.
Welcome back to the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm your host, Snowden Bishop. Last year was a tipping point for the cannabis movement. New measures passing in 8 states brought the total number of states regulating new marijuana laws to 29. That's more than half. Medical marijuana patients and advocates in the 8 states that have passed new measures are abuzz with anticipation for the new laws to take effect. Unfortunately, legislators in a number of states are pushing for delays and changes to voter-initiated marijuana laws. In Arkansas, the voter measure called for implementation in 120 days, but House lawmakers are moving to postpone the deadline by 60 more days. Maine, same thing. A new law will permit adults to possess and grow cannabis as soon as January 30th, but lawmakers have endorsed emergency legislation to delay the retail sales of it. North Dakota, Senate lawmakers unanimously passed emergency legislation to postpone the deadline for that as well. Same thing in Massachusetts. The delays are not the only cause of disappointment for patients and advocates. According to NORML, legislators in Massachusetts are also debating to make additional changes to the law, including raising the proposed retail sales tax and limiting the number of plants adults can grow at home. In Florida, same thing. Health regulators are calling for significant changes to Amendment 2, which passed with 71% of the vote. In Arizona, where Prop 205, the adult use measure, failed to win a majority vote, legislators are hard at work with 2 measures in process to limit the scope of existing medical marijuana laws, and at the same time, other measures are being introduced to expand the number of qualifying conditions. The legislative delays and confusion highlight a real and present problem with marijuana law reform. These problems also draw attention to the problem of patients traveling between states. This often includes veterans. 11 states have added PTSD to their list of medical marijuana qualifying conditions. Now, 20 of the 28 states that have programs include PTSD as a qualifying condition. None, however, require the additional burden of proving concurrent conventional treatment on PTSD victims. That is the topic of today's show and something our guests know a lot about. But before we get started, I wanted to reintroduce Dr. Brian Donner, who I mentioned last week will be joining us every week as our resident medical expert to give us our Medical Marijuana Minute update. Welcome, Dr. Donner. What do you have for us today?
Thanks, Snowden. I wanted to talk about somewhere where I practice clinically in Pennsylvania, where medical marijuana or cannabis is relatively new. I get a lot of questions from my patients on a daily basis, but one of the recurring themes that I see is, what should I do if my doctor doesn't believe in medical marijuana? My first response is to explain why the doctors are reluctant to recommend or sometimes even talk about medical cannabis. The first and most obvious reason has to do with the fact that marijuana is still considered a Schedule I controlled substance by the DEA. This means that in their mind it does not have any medical utility. And even though it's legal in some states, it's still illegal federally. This is troublesome for doctors sometimes, who, when they write prescriptions, will fall under their DEA license. They have concern that the DEA could take their license for, quote, writing a prescription for medical marijuana. It's very important to make the distinction between a recommendation or a certification versus actually writing a prescription. The second reason may have to do with the fact that most doctors really are not provided with a baseline knowledge about medical marijuana and its effects on the human body. Most medical schools don't teach it, and we do not receive any mandated education as physicians. Understanding the science behind medical cannabis is essential for this industry. Last but not least, marijuana obviously has some social and political baggage. There's some long-standing cultural stigma that is hard to overcome, and especially for those who aren't aware of the emerging science that's available. The best advice I can offer to patients whose doctors see the value of medical marijuana is to present them with some evidence that medical marijuana is safe and effective. Using science as the tool is something that most doctors respond very well to. A great place, for example, to start with this might be PubMeds.gov, which is a national database maintained by the National Institutes of Health A quick search on their website using the keyword marijuana would produce more than 24,000 different clinical studies and peer-reviewed articles that are available for their review. The best advice I can give to doctors is to become educated about marijuana now, before they advise patients against it. As providers, we have an obligation to understand all the treatment options available to our patients, and this includes medical marijuana. It's only a matter of time before federal law will catch up with patient demand. Doctors who learn about it now will be ahead of the curve when that happens, and this is imperative because their patients expect and need their guidance and input. I'm Dr. Brian Donner for the Cannabis Reporter. I'll be back again next week with another Medical Marijuana Minute. Thanks, Snowden. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Let's get started. So with all that's going on, I am very excited to introduce our guests. First, Nurse Heather Maness is the president of the Arizona Cannabis Nurses Association, a certified cannabis nurse and the nation's longest-serving medical director for a New Mexico cannabis dispensary since 2010. And as an in-home psych nurse there, she frequently helps veterans with PTSD get off their harmful pharmaceutical medications, all of which have serious side effects, and replace those with a more holistic treatment protocol with medical cannabis. Thank you, Nurse Heather, for being here. I'm so glad you could join us.
Thank you so much for having me on, Snowden. This is such an important topic. I'm really grateful to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you. And you're joined with Ken Sobel, an attorney who serves as the vice president and general counsel of the national nonprofit Grow for Vets. That's an organization that advocates on behalf of veterans safe access to medical cannabis. And you also happen to be representing the Arizona Cannabis Nurses Association in the precedent-setting case that's being heard this week in Arizona Court of Appeals. Thanks so much, Ken, for being here.
Well, first of all, Snowden, thank you so much for having us. We're very grateful, and to all of your beautiful listeners out there, we're happy to represent the residents and citizens of the United States and of Arizona in this important cause, not only for our veterans who are returning home injured and wounded from post-traumatic stress disorder and other debilitating conditions, not just them, but the majority of PTSD sufferers who are women and who are victims of either domestic violence or sexual abuse. And these people comprise about 1 out of 13 of all of the residents in Arizona, which is to say almost 500,000 people suffer from this incurable, essentially incurable disease, not to mention the 600,000 veterans who reside in Arizona. It's like the 5th largest veteran population in the U.S.
Those are numbers that we just can't ignore. Tell me a little bit about what's happening with the Court of Appeals right now.
Yeah, so the background to that is when Prop 203 was passed, it included a provision that allowed for a rulemaking process to add new debilitating conditions to the ones that were in the initiative itself. And so Nurse Heather bravely formed the Arizona Cannabis Nurses Association, and she's submitted approximately 15 petitions. A total of 36 petitions have been submitted to the Arizona Department of Health Services over the last 6 years since Prop 203 went into effect, and they've denied every single one of them. We presented, on behalf of the AZCNA, the second PTSD petition. That went through the administrative process, which resulted in the department denying adding that condition. But instead of accepting that decision, Nurse Heather went forward with me as their counsel, and we went to a 4.5-day evidentiary hearing, and we proved that not only is cannabis safe and effective for PTSD, it's perhaps the safest and most effective. And that was ruled on by a judge, administrative law judge. The director then had 30 days to either adopt that or reject it. And he instead did a little of both. He accepted it, adopted it, and proved that PTSD is a condition that's debilitating and for which cannabis can successfully be used. But he also added sua sponte, or as we say, on his own accord, without any legal justification, a requirement that a PTSD sufferer, unlike any other condition, cancer, glaucoma, you name it, is required to first go to a doctor and prove that he or she is undergoing, quote, conventional treatment before they can safely access cannabis. And that's what brings us back to Arizona today. As we took that decision up on appeal, it went to a superior court who initially ruled against us, and I've appealed it now to the Arizona Court of Appeals, Division 1 here in Maricopa.
And the outcome of that will actually dictate what really happens from here, correct?
It could. There's still one more court available, and if necessary, we will appeal to the highest court in the state of Arizona, which of course is the Supreme Court. We're hopeful, however, that Court of Appeals will understand that there's a very clear, bright line that the director crossed, that they simply don't know and understand the purpose. And
Right.
Based on all of that, we're hopeful that the appellate court will strike this offensive provision. Basically, in fairness, that all sufferers of a debilitating condition, PTSD, like the other listed conditions, they should be able to safely access their physician who would treat them or would tell them that they've diagnosed with PTSD, and then be able to get a medical card so they can safely access cannabis.
So, Nurse Heather, you treat a lot of veterans, and your experience has been, really successful with cannabis, correct?
Well, and I wouldn't necessarily say that I treat veterans. I work with veterans, and because cannabis is such a safe and gentle medication, that's why people say that they self-medicate, right? Because it's really a medication that you use as needed in the amounts that you need. And so what I try to do is really help veterans and PTSD sufferers understand the endocannabinoid system, understand the idea of endocannabinoid deficiency that is being proven by science, and to know that this is going on with PTSD, and that by supplementing their system with cannabis, this gentle plant, that they can relieve some of their symptoms. And so I do work with veterans and PTSD patients. I'm a psych nurse, so I work with a lot of different patients. But yes, I've seen such amazing results from cannabis therapeutics. And in particular, a lot of our PTSD patients prefer to inhale it, vaporize, or smoke it, because that way they get all of the goodness from the plant. Some patients prefer to eat it, but there's so many different methods of administration that patients can use that sometimes it's nice to have a nurse who understands these things kind of guide you through. And it's just amazing and so heartwarming for me to see patients be able to take control of this issue that they have with being triggered by their PTSD symptoms. And a matter of lighting a joint and sitting down for 10 minutes can literally save a patient's life who is suicidal. That's part of what happens with post-traumatic stress disorder. We hear the term all the time, 22 too many, that 22 veterans commit suicide every day. And
that is such an astonishing figure.
Today, 22 veterans will commit suicide. And if I can roll a joint and stick it in their mouth and have them puff, that to me is palliative, it's therapeutic, it's loving, it's compassionate, and it literally works within 10 minutes that they change their mind. Those things that are so horrible for them, those thoughts that are racing, they actually become more compassionate on themselves. They don't want to take their lives. They see that there's other things that they need to do and that they can do. So it's an empowerment, a patient empowerment tool for nurses. And I'm so grateful to this plant and all of the health and wellness that it provides for patients.
Yeah. And so few medical professionals that work with veterans actually understand cannabis, which is a very valid point that Dr. Donner brought up earlier. And the problem is education. And I'm sure you run into this all of the time speaking with veterans